Well, this is a historic occasion. In fact, it's history in making. Pakistan has been able to bring the two countries, countries at war, from a brink of not just disaster, but a brink of apocalypse, I would say, not just for them, but perhaps for the entire regions and the world in some ways, at least in terms of the economic stability of the globe. So that is a huge diplomatic breakthrough. But now, in terms of the negotiations itself, I think compared to yesterday or day before yesterday, where there was a lot of talk whether these negotiations would actually take place or not. Even just a day ago, 24 hours ago, we know that there was still reservations on one side and very strong statements on the other. But the great thing is that, finally the two delegations are here, the very balanced delegations, and the delegations which have authority as well, comprising, the Vice President of the US on the one hand and the Speaker of the Iranian Parliament. And we know very well that the Speaker of the Iranian Parliament has a special significance in their establishment within the regime. So that is there. So far, what we've seen in the negotiations is that, I had I had felt that they will start with indirect talks and then that would switch to direct talks. And, somehow that has exactly what happened. They started with indirect talks and then, then they had a session of direct talks as well, face to face, which has happened after decades. And so far, the indications are that the discussions were held in a positive manner, in a good ambience. But at the same time, it's not easy because there's some issues which really require a great deal of negotiations, and because the positions are so divergent. And we know that what are those issues, like some of those issues, I think they're probably not going to even discuss now. For instance, the nuclear issue. They'd probably start with the Strait of Hormuz and the extension of ceasefire and some of the humanitarian issues involved. And of course, the issue of freezing of the Iranian, unfreezing rather, of the Iranian assets which US had frozen a long time ago, which apparently are in Qatar presently. So I think those issues have been negotiated or discussed at length, and we know now that some texts have been exchanged as well. And after the leadership level exchange of discussion, exchange of ideas or views, we now see a phase of expert level talks. And that is interesting because in diplomacy, a lot of times what happens is that you have the expert level talks first, and then, the leadership level talks in the end, but not in situations of war, and because then probably the vice versa happens, and this is a situation post a war, so probably that the leadership has to meet and agree on certain principles, and then the experts can thresh out the details. But the details, sometimes it's said that the devil is in the details. So sometimes when they're trying to thresh out the details, it's not easy, and a lot of complications can arise. I had I had said that it's not going to be an easy process. There are very complicated issues involved, which have been there for decades, and some new issues have cropped up as well, like the Strait of Hormuz. So it's not going to be a very quick fix, but at the same time, I think we have a good beginning, and we can hope. We can be optimistic. But perhaps a bit cautiously, that these negotiations would result in a positive outcome. And that outcome not necessarily an outcome in terms of resolving all issues, because that requires perhaps much lengthier discussions than this. But in terms of extension of these ceasefire, in terms of opening of Strait of Hormuz, in terms of the demand by Iran of unfreezing of their assets, so that once these points are sorted out, then they can move to the more contentious issues, particularly the nuclear issue, the issue of what the Americans call the Iranian proxies, the drawdown of the U.S. troops in this region, and of course the lifting of sanctions on Iran, because and the manner that it is to be done. So let's keep our fingers crossed. Well, I believe that, in fact, I've been saying it for the last few weeks actually now, that it would be in the best interest of the US to go off ramp now, an off ramp exit. But I had also felt that it would be in the best interest of Iran to not to have a protracted war. So it was in the best interest of both the sides, and of course the Gulf countries as well, that there's an off ramp and sort of this war ends. There's only one country which was wishing differently, and that is Israel. It is not in the interest of Netanyahu, because Netanyahu only survives, he thrives on conflicts. We know the domestic politics within Israel compel him to start wars or sustain wars because of the court cases that he has and his very fragile popularity there. He would be in trouble if there are no conflicts at all, So he has a vested interest. Israel has an interest. I have detailed that, in my previous comments sometimes. Why is that? Because the threat that they face from Iran, or at least that was their threat perception, that there was a seven-way threat from Iran, and they wanted to systematically degrade the Iranian capacity in terms of its proxies and in terms of the regimes, wherever they are in countries, the regimes that it felt were basically supported by Iran, such as Yemen and Lebanon and Syria and Iraq as well. So that is there. That's a longer term policy, So they had different interests. But so far as the US, Iran, and the Gulf states are concerned, it was not in their interest to have a protracted war. And I feel that because of what I've said, and also the fact that, it's a very unpopular war in the US in general, although the hardcore Republican constituency is still supporting Trump. So Trump isn't, there's no immediate sort of pressure on Trump to stop this war. But at the same time, he knows that if it gets protracted, gradually the economic cost of the war would start to matter with his constituency as well. And in any case, it's not in Trump's nature to have protracted military actions. He always wants, if ever he starts or initiates a military action, he wants it to be quick, a swift one, with with some swift results as well for the US. Results that he could sell to his constituency, and he can. And he's a smart politician. Despite all his contradictory statements, and what people think is a bit of a madman strategy. And he can see when something is not productive anymore for him. And I get the sense that he was getting frustrated because he felt that this war was not in any way, at least sustaining this war was not in his political interest anymore.